Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on the Cowboys' Tales we ride the stories of the West Campfire truths, trail dust memories, saloon whispers. Gritty human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The desert sang like a skillet. Heat rose in shivers off the flats at Mesquite Wash, turning mesquite and stone to a wavering mirage. Jonah Whitlock rode slow reins loose in one hand, the other resting near the worn stock of his Winchester. Cinder moved the way old horses do, careful as if every step might be the one that splits the earth. He had been following a set of soft, confused tracks since morning. A chestnut mare had wandered from a drive shoe's thin stride, drifting toward the cottonwoods that guarded the only water for miles. The wash ahead carried a thin line of shade, the color of a bruise. Jonah tugged his hat brim lower and dismounted where the ground grew damp and dark. The air changed under the leaves, cooler but still heavy. A fly buzzed at his ear and then went quiet. Water ticked against stone somewhere out of sight. Jonah led Cinder by the reins and slipped between trunks pocked with old scars. He heard it on the second breath. Not wind, not bird, a sound like a mouth remembering how to use itself, wet and stitched with pain. He froze. He set the reins over a broken limb and slid the rifle from his shoulder. The cottonwoods stood close here, bark, flaking roots, braided and slick. The sound came again, low and short, and he moved toward it with the kind of patience a man learns when he wants to live. She hung from a lower branch, wrists bound high with a strip of weathered rope that had cut through skin and sunk into meat. Bare feet dragged the dirt. Her head drooped so her hair curtained the face. Above her, nailed into the pale trunk, a board burned with 3 words. Mixed blood arsonist. Jonah's breath hit the back of his throat and stayed there. He took a step back as if the sign carried a pistol. Flies circled the raw burns on her arms. Her dress was ripped half off one shoulder. Dust and blood clung in crescents along her ribs. One eye was swollen shut. The smell lifted around her metal and wrought the smell of something that wanted to die and hadn't been allowed. "Hey," he said, voice low as if speaking to a spooked colt. "You hear me?" Her chest moved, a tight, shallow hitch. "I ain't what put you there." He studied the ground without dropping his guard. Hoof prints had chewed up the soft earth under the tree. Not ranch boots. Military. The tread was neat and narrow. He noted a stub of a cigar pressed into the damp where it had bled a yellow stain. He scanned the brush and sky. Nothing moved but a shimmer of heat. He slung the rifle, pulled the knife from his belt, and reached up. The rope was dry and hot and wore a churchyard smell. His fingers worked the strand and his eyes flicked once up to the sign. The letters had been burned slow. Somebody wanted the words to last. "Not today," he said and cut. She dropped like a sack. He stepped in and caught her with his shoulder and arms. She was lighter than she should have been. Heat rolled off her skin. Her head lolled against his chest. Her lips were split and stuck together. He crouched and propped her against his knee. He fished the canteen from his saddle and tipped a little water onto a strip of clean cloth. He wet her mouth, slow, stingy. She tried to swallow everything at once, choking, and he pulled back. "Easy." Her eyes slid open, black as a cave. They did not know him. They knew the tree. He held the canteen and waited until her throat learned its work, then gave her one more sip and no more. "I'm taking you out of here," he said. He carried her to Cinder and set her across the saddle in front of him, one arm around her so she wouldn't slide. The sign creaked on its nail when the wind came back. He didn't look. The cabin lay in a split of land cut by old water and framed with dead juniper. It had a porch, a single room, a roof that held more dust than rain. The smell inside was oil and cedar and the faint sweetness of old tobacco that had soaked into the walls. Jonah shouldered the door with his hip and set her on the cot under the window where shade was thickest. Her skin shook. Her wrists oozed clear and red. He fetched the basin, poured water from a jug, stirred in a pinch of salt he kept in a jar for meat and wounds. He lit the lamp and brought the light near, held his breath at the first lift of infection's sour edge, and set his jaw. He cleaned from face to fingers, slow, careful, never rubbing where a pat would do. The cloth came away brown, then pink, then almost clean. He washed the rope grooves last. They had scalloped her all the way around. He cut the knot out of the rope with the point of his knife and laid it on the table as if it might have something to say later. He wrapped her wrists in strips torn from a shirt that had once been blue. He loosened each knot with a finger before finishing it, leaving flow. Habit from a war that had given him more than scars. She stirred when he tightened the last knot. Her neck arched. A sound came out of her that was mostly air and pain. He dipped the cloth again, touched it to her mouth, and she got 3 careful sips before sleep dragged her under. He set a cup of water where a hand could find it without looking. He moved the knife he had used to the shelf above the table. He leaned the rifle against the door, checked the bolt, checked the window latch, then checked both again. Night crawled into the wash and made itself at home. Coyotes tested the dark with thin voices. Jonah sat with his back to the door and let his eyes go soft, the way you do when you want to see movement and not shapes. He drifted and jerked and drifted again. A scrape, quick, small. Jonah woke and did not move. He watched her reflection in the black mirror of the window. The cot groaned. Her hand rose, then reached slow and true for the knife on the table that wasn't there. Fingers landed on wood, found nothing, slid to the bedside where he had left his smaller knife, by habit and not by plan. The blade flashed once in the lamplight and came at him low. He raised his forearm, steel-kissed skin, and opened a neat red smile. He stood, palms up, that was all. "I'm not them," he said. Her feet had found the floor, but barely. Fever burned her eyes into glass. Her chest heaved. She held the knife like she had learned to hold the world with a hurt hand. "The door is right there," he said, and tipped his head at it. "You can go if you want. It is 30 miles to Drywells, no water between." She didn't look at the door. She looked at him, but not the way people look when they judge. More like a person reading weather, trying to decide if the sky means what it says. Blood from his arm tapped the floor. Tap, tap, tap. "I ain't going to grab you," he said. "I ain't going to tie you. I cut you loose." Her grip loosened. The knife wobbled. It hit the board with a short, bright sound and lay there. She folded in on herself and sat on the edge of the cot and shook so hard the thin frame complained. Jonah picked up the knife and set it on the high shelf where even hope could not reach it. He pulled a rag around his forearm and knotted it. He moved slow like he was showing the room he had nothing planned. "I'm Jonah," he said. She watched him. The look was all edges. She reached for the water and almost lost the cup. He caught it with 2 fingers and held it while she drank. Thirst did what it always does. It made a person honest for a moment. "Naya," she said, "barely sound, barely there." He nodded and put the cup back where her hand could find it again. Wind came under the sill. The lamp flame tightened, then settled. Jonah kicked off his boots and sat against the door again, the rifle near his knee. He did not speak. There was nothing a word could do that silence wasn't already doing better. The cabin exhaled its night breath. Naya's breath found a rhythm and stayed with it. Her fingers did not uncurl all the way. The knots he had tied held without biting. When he rose to check the latch, he paused by the gate rope that hung inside the door. He had tied that bell on a short length of braided sisal so it would sing when riders came. He retied the end now with a neat square knot, the kind that sits tidy and minds its job. He pulled the line and heard the bell's small throat answer from the post out front. He stepped onto the porch and tasted the cool that rides just ahead of dawn. The yard was moonlit and still, mesquite threw shadows like black ribs. The cottonwoods were dark shapes against a pale wash of sky. He found nothing to aim at, and that settled nothing. He went back and set the bar and sat again. Outside, the bell on the gate trembled once. No wind touched the chimes in the cottonwoods. The sound came and went a single note in a silent yard, and the rope at the bell quivered until it didn't. Naya slept. Jonah did not. The bell's single note still lived in the wood when the sky went pale. Jonah unbarred the door and stepped into air that smelled of damp dust and creosote. The mesquites sat black against a soft gray that was trying to become morning. He kept a shadow, let his eyes settle, then walked the fence line slow. The ground told a story if you let it. Near the corner post, the soil stayed loose from last week's wind. He crouched and set his palm to it. One set of prints, narrow heel, neat tread. Cavalry. The weight had lingered. By the barn, a second set overlapped the first, where someone had stood and studied the house. Jonah found a flake of fresh brass by the trough and a cigar nub pressed flat into clay. He lifted it with 2 fingers. Damp. He placed it on the fence rail and straightened. He did not wake Naya. He walked the line twice more, then fetched a length of wire and tightened the gate latch until it closed without sound. Back inside, he slid the bar, checked the rifle, and poured coffee into a tin cup. The cabin smelled like fire and old beans, and under it was the thin note of infection fading from the bandages. On the cot, Naya slept hard, a hand near the cup he had set for her. Her fingers were swollen but less angry. The knots he had tied sat low and neat. He kept his hands busy with leather and oil until her breath shifted and she woke. She drank with a care she had not shown the first night. No spill, no choke. When she had enough, she set the cup down and pulled Jonah's white shirt tighter around her shoulders. She did not ask about the bell. He did not tell. For 3 days the air hung hot and friendly to flies. Naya stayed by the window, wrapped in that shirt, watching the yard like a hunter who had traded her bow for eyes. The fever broke and took its glassy edge with it. Her color climbed back into her face. When she slept now, her hands loosened, though they never forgot the habit of fists. Late on the 4th evening, the wash picked up a breath, and the light went the color of peach skin. Naya stood without speaking and moved to the door. Jonah looked up from sharpening a small blade on a whetstone. He did not stand. He only watched her pull on his coat and step out into the warm. She went barefoot. The earth held the heat like a secret. Dust curled around her ankles. She crossed the yard with the careful tread of someone learning the ground again and stopped where the dirt took a thumbprint. She chose a thin stick from the kindling pile and knelt. The first line was one long curve that caught the lean of a wing. The next cut into it clean and hard, a beak open as if calling. She drew with a patience that made the air change around her. The thunderbird came up out of the yard, body tapering, tail stretched with flame. It looked ready to move. Jonah stood then. He left his knife on the step and walked until he stood a few feet behind her. He kept his voice low. "What bird is that?" She did not look up. The stick moved. Enough red dust came up under it that she had to blow once to clear the line. "My mother painted this when the canvas burned," she said. Her voice still carried gravel, but it had room in it now. She said, "You keep drawing until the fire understands who it is eating." Jonah set his hand on the ground near the tail palm flat. The dirt gave and was still warm from the day. The thunderbird's wing shadow touched his fingers. "You were there," he said. Naya nodded. She traced the curve of a feather and let the air go out of her. His presence sat beside her like a fact, not an answer. A fly worked the back of Jonah's neck and left. From the ridge a coyote talked once and got no reply. Wind pushed the smell of horses from the corral and a hint of something sharp from the well that sat just beyond it. Jonah watched her finish the bird and smoothed the line at the jaw with the side of her finger. When she was done, she touched the center of the thunder creature with her palm as if to warm it. He saw the red thread then, thin, looped at her throat, the end of it frayed like silk that had been rubbed between 2 soft fingers for years. She tucked it under the shirt and stood. He saw the bell rope too. The knot he had tied last night sat snug, a square knot that lay like a coin. He did not remember the tail facing that way. He looked at it, and his skin lifted a fraction. He went to the gate as if to test the latch. When he touched the rope, he felt that the knot had been remade by a different hand, a good hand. The tails sat on opposite sides. He took the rope in both hands and retied it the way his hands trusted. He kept his face empty. Naya watched him. She rested the stick across her thigh and let it fall. No questions came. She walked back to the porch and sat on the top step with her bare heels in the dust. Morning brought riders. Jonah heard them before he saw them. Iron spoke to stone at the far end of the wash. Cinder lifted his head in the corral and made a low sound that never made it to a whinny. Jonah stepped into the yard and let the sun find him. He wore his hat low and the rifle was nowhere in sight. The bell rope sat quiet. 3 men came through the shimmer at a walk. They were neat in the saddle. The one in front wore a face that held every line like it had been drawn with a ruler. The badge on his coat caught a slip of light. He swung down at the edge of the yard and took off his gloves finger by finger without looking at Jonah. "Lieutenant Abner Cole," he said. His voice fit the badge. "United States Cavalry, Jonah Whitlock. You've been out here long. Long enough to know what shade is worth." Cole smiled, but only with his mouth. He pulled a paper from inside his coat and offered it across his palm. Jonah kept his hand steady as he took it. The drawing was rough. The eyes were not. They were carved black and set too deep. The name underneath was Anna Vega. Words under that said murder and arson and escape. The number at the bottom was 75. "You seen her," Cole said. Jonah kept his face still. He let the paper stay in his hand like it burned. He thought about the knot at the gate and the line of the thunderbird in his yard and the way salt water had stung in bandage grooves. He gave the paper back. "No," he said. Cole tilted his head. He looked past Jonah at the door where wood met wood and a single seam of light painted the jamb. He looked long enough to be rude and not long enough to be illegal. "You live alone." "Company never did me much good." Cole's eyes came back to him. They held a question he did not intend to ask out loud. "Mind if we look around?" "I do." Cole did not change. He put his gloves back on. He slid the paper into his coat. He nodded, like the two of them had just concluded a bit of business, then reached into a saddlebag and tossed a second poster onto the porch, where it landed beside Naya's bare foot. She did not move. She drew her foot back and let the paper fall into the dust. "In case your memory improves," he said. "Sometimes a man's mind opens when there is money on the other side." Jonah said nothing. The men rode out the way they came. Cole did not look back. Dust stood and then collapsed. Naya bent and picked up the paper by the clean corner. Her fingers shook once and then held. She turned it so the light took the lines. The mouth on the drawing was wrong and the nose was a guess, but the eyes were close. She folded the paper once and set it on the step and put a small rock on it the way people mark graves when wood is scarce. Inside the cabin, the quiet was thick. Jonah set the rifle on pegs above the door and sat. He wiped his arm where the cut had closed to a narrow seam. Naya stood by the window where she had stood 10 hours a day for 3 days and did not look out. She held her hand to her chest and left it there long enough for the shirt to lift and fall under it. Then she crossed the room and pressed that same hand to Jonah's chest above the place where his heart worked slow. He did not speak. He put his hand over hers. Heat passed under their palms like current. It settled them both. She withdrew and sat on the cot. The lamp cracked once and held steady. That night, Jonah oiled the hinges and set the bar and sat by the door while Naya dozed and started and dozed again. He took the bell rope down and retied it twice until the line lay the way he liked it. He fixed the latch on the rear window so it closed clean. He counted his cartridges without touching the box, the number living in his head where he kept such things, and then he counted them with his hands anyway, because heads lie when nerves talk. Sometime near dawn, the wash got the color of pewter. Jonah stood with his palm on the door and felt the cool of outside through it. The rope gave a whisper. The bell outside spoke once, not a ring, a breath of a note. He opened the door and crossed the yard to the fence. On the nail above the crossbar, a short length of rope hung. It was cut clean on both ends. The fibers were black at the tips and brittle to the touch. He plucked it free. His fingers came away with a smear of charcoal. The nail head was new, bright hammered deep. He looked out over the wash at the cottonwoods and then at the ridge where the land rose like a shoulder. He did not call into the dark, and nothing in the dark answered. He stood there with the cut rope in his hand until the light made the thunderbird in the yard show itself again, and the wind shifted and took the cigar smoke that had been living near the well and thinned it into nothing. The rope left a mark on his palm, char and fiber. Jonah scrubbed it off at the basin and watched the water go gray, then clear. The cabin had the slow hush of a place holding its breath. Naya sat on the cot with the poster folded once on her knee. She ran her thumb along the crease and did not open it. "Tell me your name," Jonah said. She kept her eyes on the paper. The air in the room felt warmer by a notch. "They wrote Anna," she said. "That is not mine. I am Naya Redbird." He nodded. He waited. He set a log on the coals and watched the small flame find its corners. She opened the poster at last. She held it so the light from the window ran across the hard lines of the drawing. The paper shook once and then steadied. "The woman on this is a fire," she said. "They made me into a fire because a fire takes the blame." She set the paper beside her and stood. She crossed to the door and looked out through the thin seam where the wood met wood. The yard lay bright as a blade. The thunderbird she had drawn still held its shape, the lines clean where her stick had cut the crust. "Margaret brought bread," she said. The words came even. She came with flour on her hands and blue under one eye. She said the blue was the door. She laughed at that. The next night he was drunk, and the door was on her again. She ran to our camp at dawn. My mother put her in our tent and told her to sleep. Men came by noon and said we stole her. She came out with the blue on her face and said no. They looked over her head and said yes. Naya did not turn. She watched a breeze move the dust over the thunderbird's wing. At night, the canvas breathed like a living thing, she said. I was under the cedar roots, and the smoke went past me like hands. I heard my mother's brush on the canvas. She was painting the bird. She said, keep drawing until the fire learns your name. The canvas went bright, and then it went nothing, and the air was loud. The men laughed. Margaret called once, and then she did not call again. She pressed her forehead to the edge of the door just for a moment, then let her head lift, and drew a breath that reached the bottom of her ribs. I took maps after, she said, from the table in the command tent, lines where the iron will go through places that hold bones. They called me thief and arsonist, and a new name to make it tidy. They put a rope on me, and then it went wrong for them. I ran. Jonah listened like a man listens for a river he cannot see. He could hear his own blood in his ear. He could hear the pop in the stove as the log settled. He walked to the poster and picked it up. He did not look at the face again. He opened the stove door and fed the paper to the flame. The paper curled at the corners. The ink went soft and bled, then turned hard and black and broke. The smell was sweet and sharp. When the paper folded in on itself and dropped, he shut the door and slid the iron home. "All right," he said. She did not thank him. She stood still with her hand at her throat where the red thread lay. Her fingers rolled the end of it once and let it fall. Jonah moved past her and stepped into the yard. The sun hit him clean. He crossed to the fence where the cut rope had hung. The nail that held it was bright as a coin in a stream. He set his palm on the top rail and felt the skin of the wood. One place felt freshly worked. He leaned in. 3 words had been carved into the soft grain with a careful hand. "We see you." The cuts were deep enough to hold shadow at noon. He rocked back on his heels. He looked at the bell rope. The knot sat the way he had tied it an hour ago. He pulled it once and let the bell give its small answer. When he went inside again, Naya was sitting with both feet on the floor and her hands in her lap. The shirt he had given her hung loose. Her wrists were wrapped neat and white. Her face had lost the swollen look. She watched him and did not blink. "They were close," he said. "I know," she said. They did not speak more. There was not much that would land right. The cabin took the heat of the afternoon and made it lazy. Flies tracked slow circles and then forgot what they were doing. Jonah moved through the room quiet, readying small things that make large things possible. He filled canteens and set them under the table. He checked the cinch straps that had dried stiff on the peg and worked them until they softened. He pulled a pair of boots from under the bed and set them by the door for Naya. He tested the lamp with a new wick and poured oil until the meniscus rose and stopped. Naya worked in the same silence. She tore a sheet into strips and rolled them tight. She put dried meat into a small sack and tied it with a square knot that sat flat. She found the little tin of salt and tucked it beside the strips. When she lifted the rifle from the pegs above the door, she ran her thumb along the stock as if reading a story written in grain. She unwound the red thread from her neck and tied it to the sling swivel with a sailor's knot he did not know. The thread lay there like a narrow tongue of fire. He watched the knot for a beat. The tails pointed opposite the way he would set them. It would hold anyway. That was what mattered. The light outside went soft and then softer. The wash learned a new color. Jonah saddled Cinder and the bay mare with practiced hands, no clink, no talk. Leather creaked like a man turning over in sleep. The smell of sweat and horse rose and sat under the porch roof. Naya pulled the boots on and winced once as her foot found the seam at the heel. She stood and took a step and then another. Her balance had the memory of its work. Inside, Jonah checked the bar one last time and then lifted it free. He left the cabin clean and square. He set the knife on the shelf and took it back down and slid it into his belt. He took the poster rock from the step and set it on the windowsill. He pulled the bell rope tight to hear the small throat sing and let it slack again so it would not knock in a wind. They led the horses into the yard. The Thunderbird's lines caught what was left of the Sunwing bright-eyed dark. Naya crouched and touched the center of the bird with her palm and said something soft in a language that carried the cadence of water on stone. Jonah waited with the reins loose. She stood and took them and swung into the saddle without a sound. They rode toward the wash. The light thinned. Heat slid away from their legs. The cottonwoods on the edge held their leaves very still. A long way off, a coyote spoke like a hinge that needed oil and then stopped. Jonah let Cinder pick the ground. He did not look back at the house. The ridge above Mesquite Wash wore the first shadow. 3 horses stood just inside the brush where the land rolled. A man with a straight back and a badge under his coat held a glass to his eye and worked the focus until it found the yard and the 2 figures riding out of it. Lieutenant Cole watched them pass the cottonwoods and enter the cut where the wash turned. He lowered the glass and let the strap hang against his coat. "Let them go," he said. The tracker beside him smiled with the thin part of his mouth. He had the kind of face that forgot how to change. He took the reins in one hand and waited. Cole slid the glass into its case and snapped the leather shut. The sound was small and tidy. As the last of the light left the yard, the bell at the gate gave one close, shy note. The rope trembled and then was still. The words in the fence rail held their shadow. The Thunderbird's tail blurred. The door of the cabin stayed closed, and the window held a square of dark that did not give anything away. Moonlight lay on the wash like quicksilver. The air had cooled enough to taste the rocks. Every footfall clicked and settled. Jonah let Cinder choose the path while his eyes worked the dark. Naya rode close, the red thread on the rifle sling catching a thin line of light when the moon found it. They kept to the open where the ground was honest. Brush held shadows that made stories of their own, and stories out here often had teeth. A long way off, a burro called once and then forgot what it wanted. The cottonwoods behind them slipped into gray. The first shot did not belong to the land. It cracked the night like a board breaking and then rattled itself quiet across the stone. Jonah lifted in the saddle. Heat bloomed in his side and raced under his ribs. The world jumped and then tilted. He saw the sky and then he saw dirt. He hit hard and rolled to his knees before his body decided to sit. His mouth filled with copper. He clamped his palm to his side and felt wet. The wet kept coming. He breathed once and counted what still worked. Hands, eyes, one leg steady and one that wanted to fold. Naya hauled her mare around and was on the ground before the horse had finished its turn. She slid in behind Jonah and got her shoulder under his arm. Another shot cracked and found the rock behind them with a mean little spark. Stone dust drifted like ash. "Here," she said. Her voice held the calm of a person who had watched worse. "Keda." He let her pull him. The cut of the wash offered a split in the earth where water had once bitten. They dropped into it. The walls rose chest high and ran tight and crooked. Sand had sifted into the bottom in a soft bed. Jonah's breath yanked and then steadied. Blood soaked his shirt and warmed his fingers. Naya tore the canteen from its thong and got a look at the wound. The bullet had gone in shallow above the hip and torn a path along the muscle. It had a way of bleeding that threatened to tell the rest of him how to quit. She dumped water into her palm and cleaned what she needed to see. She scooped a thin mud from the damp seam under the wall and pressed it over gauze until the bleed slowed. Her hands moved without hurry and without waste. "Stay," she said, which is what people say to hurt animals because animals know that word. She put his hand on the dressing and pressed until he took the pressure himself. His lips made a thin line and never let the sound out. She took the Winchester and worked the lever once. Metal made a sound like a question being asked. She slid to the mouth of the cut and let one eye live in the crack. Two figures came through the brush, stepping slow, leading their horses by the reins. They had the caution of men who have learned to be cautious on paydays. A third shape hung back on a rise and watched. Naya breathed. She lifted the sights until the front bead found the gap in the lead man's stride. The moon slid out from behind a cloud and painted his leg. She touched the trigger. The rifle spoke. The man went to one knee with a howl and clawed for the horse that did not want him. The second man dove for a rock and vanished. Naya jacked the rifle and fired a wide shot into open gravel on the far side of the cut. Stone jumped and sang as if a second rifle had found an angle. She waited 3 heartbeats and fired again from the same place as the first shot. The echo worked like a third voice. The men froze. The one she had hit shouted, and the shout dragged fear out of their throats. The watcher on the rise hissed something short. They fell back, hauling the wounded man by his belt, getting small behind brush and shape. Hooves scuffed and then retreated. Silence grew back in a thin layer. Naya kept the rifle on the crack until the night lost their breath. Then she slid back to Jonah. He had not moved far. His hand kept his own weight on the compress. His skin was gray at the edges and his eyes were clear. "Still here," he said. "Good," she said. She pulled a coil of rope from her saddlebag and glassed the entry to their cut. The ground forced any approach to cross a shallow lip of stone where footing went tricky. She tied one end to a jut of root and took the other to an elbow bend in the wall. Her hands made a knot she had learned on a different day. The lay of it put the pull where the weight would want to go. It made a trip at knee height that would slide and cinch when a boot hit it hard. She stepped over it and back to teach her feet the move. She found Jonah's belt knife and cut the rest of the rope into 2 short lines. She tied one as a handhold above him. She tied the other tight around the butt of the rifle and a rock in the wall. If she needed to let the gun go, it would hang and not drop into the sand. She looked to the sky. The moon had climbed and gone pale. The cold had found the bottom of the wash and was getting comfortable. Jonah's breath had smoothed out, sweat lined his hair. He watched her hands and said nothing. When he did speak at last, it came like gravel rolling. "Water," he said. She lifted the canteen and let him wet his mouth, but no more. He swallowed and closed his eyes, and then opened them again because closing them made the dark change places. She listened for horses and heard none. She set her ear to the stone and felt for the dull thud hooves make when they hit the ground hard. Nothing. She looked up and saw the rise and the ridge and the wash letting itself be land again. "We move," she said. He did not argue. She got his arm over her shoulder and let him stand with most of his weight on her. They moved sideways so he would not have to lift his feet more than he had to. At the lip of the cut, she eased him up to the flat and made him lay against the earth where the sage kept a kind of blind. She left him there long enough to bring the horses by the long way so hoof marks would not tell the whole truth. She lowered the saddles and lashed them back on with a care he would have admired if he had the room. She ran the girths and checked them twice. She led Cinder down to him. She spoke to the horse once, and Cinder listened. She got Jonah up with a grunt and a curse he never used, and settled him across the saddle in a low seat. She took a length of the cut rope and made a belt around him and the horn and the swell. The knot she finished was clean, and could be opened fast if the horse went wrong. He watched her tie it. "That one holds," he said. "It holds," she said. She took the second horse by the reins and breathed until both animals tuned their ears to her and not to the wash. She put her hand on Jonah's thigh and felt the jump that said pain had not got all the way to the bone. She clicked her tongue and started them up the long side of the draw. They did not go back to the main trail. She put their line across stone where hooves slip and do not print. When the ground forced them into sand, she led them up a trickle of old water where the mark would read confused. She let the wind do its job where the ridge funneled it. On the open stretch, she rode loose and let the horses think they were alone. Behind them, 2 soldiers came low through the brush and found the trap. The first man's shin hit the line and his body turned without asking permission. He went down hard and yelled. The second grabbed his coat and hauled him so the scuffle made a map for anyone with the right eyes to read. The tracker slid in with a look that made men quiet. He saw the knot in the root and the tail of the rope and the prints that showed how the woman had stepped over and not touched. He did not speak. He pointed the way Naya had not gone, and Cole understood. Cole held his glass to the light and lowered it. He wiped his mouth with one gloved hand and studied the ground with his head tilted like a man smelling a stew he could not name. He saw blood on the rock and a line of crushed sage. He saw where hooves had turned to stone when they could, and to the dead creek when they could not. He put the glass away. He remounted and set his horse off at a walk without letting his shoulders say what he had decided. In the cut, the trap rope still held its new memory. The knot would stay neat until weather unwound it. A pebble that had been kicked hard slid and settled and made no more noise. Night thinned until stars went dull. The air took on that metal taste that comes before day. Naya led the horses through a low slot in the ridge where the land changed its mind about what it wanted to be. The wind found her and put dry fingers in her hair. She checked Jonah's face. Sweat had dried in a salt line along his jaw. His eyes were open and clear enough. "Talk," she said. "A word." "Thirst," he said with a smile that tried and halfway made it. She gave him a mouthful and tucked the canteen back into the loop. She put her hand to the red thread and felt the twist of it. The knot lay true. The thread seemed to hold heat of its own. She let her hand fall and took the lead again. The land opened to a bowl of pale grass and scattered stone. A dry riverbed cut a pale line to the south where scrub crowded the banks in a thin green. Naya guided them into it and followed the bend until the banks rose higher and stole the light. The sand here had been worked by wind and bought them a little erasure. Jonah cleared his throat. "You grew up with that bird," he said. "With smoke and paint," she said. "With the way a line keeps its edge when everything else runs." He nodded and let the answer sit. The horses walked. Their breath showed in small ghosts. The bells of their bits did not speak. The desert held them and did not argue. The moon slid behind a rag of cloud and the world got small and close and quiet. Morning found them in a country that smelled like water. The dry riverbed ran to a shallow stream that cut a silver path through reeds and low willow. The banks wore grass and the air carried the clean bite of stone that had been washed. Naya led both horses into the current and let it tug the heat from their legs. Jonah sat crooked in the saddle and kept one hand pressed to his side. His breath met the cool and steadied. They followed the stream until it bent into a pocket of trees where the wind went soft. Pines climbed a slope above the water and gave the light a green cast. The place felt like it kept its own time. Naya chose a spot where rocks stood close together, good for a wall, and where the ground took a stake without complaint. They made a tent from canvas and a wool blanket. They laid Jonah down and let the shade work. The wound wanted attention each day. Naya boiled water in a blackened tin and let it cool until it could be touched. She rinsed the cut and changed the bandage, careful with the edges that liked to stick. Salt sat light on the tongue when she tasted the air above the bowl. Jonah took each breath through his nose and held still. He looked at the trees and let their tops sway for him. When he could stand, he stood with one hand on the doorframe of the shelter and watched the stream find the same stones again and again. He walked in short lines at first. Cinder waited like an old friend and put a forehead against Jonah's shoulder most afternoons. The bay mare took a shine to Naya and followed her without a lead when she moved from fire to water. A young Mustang showed up one morning at the edge of the pine's ribs under Hide Eyes Clear. Naya clicked her tongue and the colt gave her one look and stayed. Jonah named the horse Juniper because the animal liked to stand under the tree and steal its shade. They built what the hands could build. A wall of pine logs notched and set. A roof of planks that leaked on heavy days and kept off most of the night. A door that swung true because Jonah planed each edge until it listened. He hung a bell at the gate and tied it on a length of rope he braided in 3. The tails faced the yard the way he trusted. The bell gave a soft note when deer passed and a different one when a person touched the line. Naya learned the sound and the difference sat easy in her ear. She drew a thunderbird on the boards of the small barn with a lump of charcoal she kept in a tin. The strokes were sure body-long wings open. Rain darkened the wood and blurred the lines. She came back with the charcoal and brought the bird up again. The drawing lived and faded and lived again. That felt right. Inside a table held a small cloth and a tin of needles and a skein of red thread that had been around Naya's neck. She unspooled the thread and stitched a shirt no longer than her forearm. Each seam was small and even. At the collar she laid the thread in a curve that made the idea of a bird more than a bird. Jonah watched her work and did not say anything because the line had its own voice. The shirt sat on the table and made the room feel larger. Late afternoons belonged to light chores and quiet talk. Jonah knocked dogs out of pine planks and listened to how the grain wanted to go. Naya scrubbed pots with sand and set them in the stream to rinse. Juniper learned how to take a rope without fuss and how to carry a saddle without saying no with his whole body. The horses chewed and blew soft through their noses, and their breath hung like pale smoke once the nights turned cooler. Sometimes Naya woke before dawn and stepped into the yard while the world kept its last dark. She stood with her palm at the center of her chest the way she had done in the cabin, and she let her breath find the air. She listened for the old noise of fear and heard the simple noise of trees. She returned to bed with pine on her skin and let sleep take her whole. Jonah moved like a man who had learned not to waste. The limp stayed. He did not complain because a limp is a kind of memory that does not need words. He learned the paths deer cut through the brush and the way the stream shifted after a night of wind. A hawk owned the sky above their bend and sat on a snag near the meadow. When the bird lifted its shadow crossed their yard and went quick over the door, and the bell rope and the barn wall where the charcoal thunderbird waited for another touch. On a soft day, he took down the rifle and wiped the red thread that tied to the sling swivel. The knot Naya had tied lay opposite, the way his thumb liked to read a knot. He left it. He stood in the yard and took aim at nothing, and lowered the gun and put it away. A trader found them one noon with a mule that carried coffee and salt and a sack of nails. He stayed at the edge of the yard and said he did not see anyone he was not supposed to see. He traded a bag of beans for a curry comb and promised to forget the bend in the river when he told stories in town. His mule drank and rolled an eye at Juniper, who pretended not to care. Naya set a loaf of coarse bread on the table after he left. The bread cut clean and held together. Jonah ate slowly and kept that pace after the last bite because the body listens longer when it has been empty. They made a small thing inside for the breeze to touch. A circle of twine hung above the bed with lengths of rope tied to it. The knots were all different. A bowline, a clove hitch, a square knot like a coin. One hung reverse tails pointing where a window faced north. It turned when wind came and returned to that position when the room fell still. Toward evening, Jonah walked the fence and set his palm on the top rail the way he had at the old place. The wood took the touch and gave nothing back, and that was good. He checked the bell rope and felt the braid under his fingers. It felt like a thing people had made together. Naya came to stand beside him. They did not speak. The stream talked for them. She finished the tiny shirt and laid it on the back of a chair. A line of red curved across the front like a wing that had just found lift. She set the needle back in its tin. Her hand rested on her belly for a moment light and sure, and then fell. She went outside and called Juniper with a click that he knew now meant come near and do not show off. In the barn, the charcoal lines of the Thunderbird had begun to soften at the edges. She took the tin and climbed the rail and drew the curve back into the wing. Jonah stood in the doorway and watched the bird take its shape. He put his hand flat on the nearest board and held it there. When she came down, she put her palm over his and pressed the warmth of her skin to the back of his hand. Their hands warmed the wood where the bird lived. Far to the north, in a room with white walls and a map tacked to it by bayonets, a man in a neat coat opened a drawer. A short piece of cut rope lay inside ends charred. He held it, then set it down, then closed the drawer. He sat very still, as if stillness could put a thing in order. Evenings in the pine bend settled into small sounds: spoons in a tin cup, the slap of water against a stone step, the quick paw of a fox in dry leaves. The bell spoke sometimes the way a throat clears. The notes were low and even. When night came full, the house breathed the clean dark. Juniper stamped and blew. The stream kept its steady talk. The knot over the bed turned a little, then came to rest with the reversed tails toward the window that held a square of soft sky. The shirt on the chair caught moonlight along its collar where the red line lay. The charcoal bird on the barn faced east, ready to meet light. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.